The year was 1884. Winter was fast approaching the Virginia Appalachians, and with it came a stillness that chilled more than just the air.
The cold had settled deep in her bones. Addie knew she had to find shelter before nightfall, or the wind would take them both.
They assumed she was lost to the wilderness. They gave up. But they were wrong. Addie was alive. 8 days she had searched this mountain, finding nothing but rock and dust. Now, only the stubborn stones stood in her way. For 8 days she had labored in the dark, but it was the silence that finally gave it away. The mountain was alive.
The fire road ended at a rusted gate nobody had oiled since the summer crews pulled out. Beyond it, the forest closed over the trail like a jaw. October 14th, 1884, a Monday. The light was already failing by mid-afternoon, the way it does in the southern Appalachians when the ridgelines steal the sun 2 hours before the rest of the world loses it. Addie Ferrell had been walking since noon. She'd left from a crossroads outside Calhoun, a town that existed mostly because the railroad had decided to stop there once briefly before deciding to stop somewhere else. 6 miles by her count, maybe 7 by the mountains' reckoning, because the mountains never measured the way people did. They added elevation to every step, turned flat distance into something the body paid for in sweat, in the particular ache that settles behind the knees when the grade refuses to level off. Her boots were wet through. That had happened at Lick Branch, down in the hollow where the trail crossed the creek at what looked like a shallow ford. Looked like. The water ran fast for something so narrow, knee-deep where it appeared to be 8 inches, the surface deceptively smooth in the gray afternoon light. She'd committed to the crossing at the narrowest point, 3 long strides, stone to stone, but the current had found her left foot on the second step. Not a dramatic fall. The creek simply reached up, took hold, pulled her boot off the rock, planted her left leg calf-deep in water cold enough to make her inhale sharply through her teeth. She caught herself with her right hand on a boulder, recovered, made the far bank with both boots full of water. The temperature was falling. She'd checked the thermometer hanging outside the general store in Calhoun at 2 o'clock that afternoon. 51 degrees Fahrenheit, the mercury sitting just below the second hash mark on the glass. The storekeeper had watched her read it without comment. By towers, with the elevation gain, she estimated it had dropped below 40. The sky carried a color she knew, not storm dark, not overcast, something more specific, the color of old pewter left in a drawer. Particular stillness in the air, the kind that precedes weather but doesn't commit to a direction. She'd grown up reading skies like that. Her father had taught her to watch for the moment when birds stopped crossing the ridgeline. When that happened, whatever was coming would arrive within 12 hours. No birds had crossed the ridgeline in the last 20 minutes. She shifted the pack on her shoulders. The leather straps had worn grooves into the wool of her coat where they rode. Twin furrows she could feel through the fabric when she pressed her fingers against her collarbones. The pack itself was a 65-liter canvas and leather affair, the kind drovers used, with brass buckles gone green at the edges. Every strap had been adjusted so many times that the leather had memorized her body's measurements better than she had. Pack weighed close to 40 pounds, it felt like 60. Wet boots did that. They didn't just add weight to the feet. They added weight to the mind, a constant low-grade reminder that something had gone wrong, that the body's first line of defense against cold had been compromised, that the clock was now running. She kept walking. The trail climbed through oak, hickory. The occasional hemlock stand dark as I held breath between the hardwoods. Dead leaves covered the ground in layers, this year's on top, still holding their copper, last year's beneath, compressed to a brown mat that turned slick on the inclines. She moved through them with the stride of someone who had been walking for a long time. Not just today. Not just this week. 14 months of walking if she counted it honestly, starting from the morning she'd packed this bag in the house that was no longer her house. Daniel Ferrell had died in the Calhoun No. 3 mine on August 19, 1883. She did not think about it the way people expected a widow to think about it, with the soft dissolving grief that made other women reach for her hand in church. She thought about it the way you think about a wall that falls on you. One day the wall is standing. The next day it is on the ground, along with the roof, the chimney, the window frame her mother-in-law had shipped from Roanoke, the small herb garden she'd built along the south side where the light was best. Everything she'd arranged her life around had been resting on the assumption that the ceiling of a coal mine would hold. The ceiling did not hold. 14 men went into the No. 3 drift on a Tuesday morning. 11 came out. Daniel was not among the 11. The company paid nothing. Not because the families didn't ask. Because the company's lawyer, a man named Claiborne, who rode the train in from Richmond wearing a suit that cost more than anything in any house in Calhoun, explained in patient language that the men had assumed the risk of employment when they accepted wages. That was the phrase, assumed the risk. As though Daniel had stood at the mine entrance on his first day, looked into the dark, measured the angle of the support timbers, calculated the probability of collapse, weighed against $3 a day, then walked in with full knowledge of what the mountain might do to him. The law, Claiborne explained, was clear. Virginia courts had upheld this principle in every relevant precedent. The company was sorry for the family's loss. The company bore no financial obligation. Addie had sat in the third pew of the Calhoun courthouse during that hearing, hands in her lap, listening. She had not cried. Crying was a thing she'd stopped doing in October, a month after the funeral, when she'd realized that grief had a floor somewhere below the crying, a bedrock where everything went quiet. She'd hit that floor early. What replaced the tears was something harder, a kind of clarity that operated like cold at sharpened edges, let her see the shape of things without sentiment blurring the lines. The shape of things was this. Daniel's father held the deed to the land the house sat on. The house had been a wedding gift, spoken aloud in front of witnesses but never put in writing. Obed had never intended to reclaim it. He was a decent man mostly. But Obed's second son was not a decent man, partly. Wallace had debts, the house had value. 11 months after Daniel's death, Wallace convinced Obed that the property should be consolidated under the family name, for tax purposes, he said, for simplicity. Obed filed the paperwork. Addie contested it. The same courthouse, the same pew, a different lawyer this time, one she'd paid with the money Daniel had kept in a tobacco tin under the bed. The lawyer did his best. His best was not enough. Virginia law was clear on this point too. The deed belonged to Obed Ferrell. The house belonged to whoever held the deed. Addie Ferrell was not that person. The day the ruling came down, Addie walked home. It was still home for another 72 hours. The judge had granted her that sit on the front step, looked at the herb garden she'd built, measured the distance between what she'd had yesterday morning, which was little enough, but hers, a life shaped around a specific piece of ground. She measured the distance between that yesterday morning, everything she'd have tomorrow, which was the contents of one leather pack, 23 silver dollars left after the lawyer's fee, a folding knife with a bone handle her father had given her, a wool blanket thick enough to sleep under, a flint and steel fire kit, a length of good rope, 5 days of dried food, 2 pairs of extra socks, a first aid tin she'd packed herself with strips of clean linen, a small bottle of iodine, a needle with heavy thread. She measured that distance with the same cold clarity the mine floor had taught her. Then she packed the bag. She was not running, she was finished. That had been 14 months ago. She'd worked her way through Patrick County, across Pulaski County, a season picking apples near Wytheville, 3 months washing laundry for a boarding house in Galax, where the owner asked no questions because she preferred workers who had nowhere else to go. Addie had saved what she could, spent only what she had to, kept moving because movement was the thing that replaced the house, the garden, the particular corner of the front step where the morning light hit first. Movement became the structure. Movement became the walls. 3 weeks before this October afternoon, she'd stood in a general store in Floyd County, looking at a survey map tacked to the wall behind the counter. The storekeeper used it to direct hunters, pointing out hollows, creek crossing. Addie had studied it while waiting for her change, memorizing the contour lines the way she'd once memorized the rows of her garden. Hatchet Knob, elevation 3,840 feet. The ridgeline ran northeast to southwest. The downslope side caught less wind. She'd filed that information the way she filed everything now, precisely without emotion, in the ledger of survival she kept in the back of her mind. She knew nobody filed permits on that ground. She knew nobody patrolled it after September when the last of the summer survey crews came down. That was enough. By the time she cleared the tree line below the ridge, the temperature had dropped to what she estimated was 38, maybe lower. Her base layer, a cotton shirt she'd been meaning to replace with wool since Galax, was soaked from the creek crossing. The cold was no longer a background condition. It had become the foreground, the thing every other thought had to push through. Her fingers, her feet, the skin along her ribs, where the wet cotton clung, all of it was transmitting the same message. Stop. Build shelter. Build heat. The order mattered. Shelter first, because heat without shelter was just warmth bleeding into wind. She moved along the limestone bluff, not looking for the cave, looking for the wind to stop. That was the better strategy, the one her father had taught her when she was 12 years old, tracking deer through a snowstorm in Patrick County. Don't look for the shelter, Addie. Look for where the wind quits. The shelter is behind it. She found it before she found the opening. A sudden quiet. Not silence, the forest was never silent, but a dropping away of the low constant pressure. The wind had been pressing against the left side of her face for the last hour. She stopped, turned her head. The wind was still moving above her. She could hear it in the canopy. But at the base of the bluff, something had changed. Stone had come between her body, the gale, the sound itself had thinned. The cave mouth was low, maybe 5 feet tall at the peak of the arch, 8 feet across at its widest, northeast facing. Dark inside, smelling of wet mineral, old leaves, the particular musk of a space that had been breathing its own air for a long time. She set down her pack, pulled the small oil lamp from the side pocket, struck a match. The flame caught, steadied. She adjusted the wick, held the lamp at arm's length ahead of her. Went in, 14 feet deep, 8 feet wide at the mouth, narrowing to 4 at the back wall. The ceiling sloped downward toward the rear. She could stand upright for the first 10 feet, then had to duck, then couldn't straighten at all against the back wall. Not enough. She knew that immediately, the way you know a room is wrong the moment you step into it. The back wall was solid limestone, pale gray in the lamp beam, unmarked. The ceiling was too low, the space was too shallow. A person could survive a night here, maybe 2. Not a winter, but the floor was dry gravel. The temperature inside, even without a fire, was already 5 degrees warmer than the hollow outside, maybe more. She held her hand flat, palm down, 6 inches above the gravel. No updraft, no moving air. The wind did not reach this place. She dropped her pack against the back wall, stood there breathing, water still running from her bootlesses onto the gravel. She did the math she already knew the answer to. 3 weeks, maybe, before this hollow turned dangerous. Before the first hard freeze locked the creek. Before the temperature dropped below what a wool blanket, a fire, a shallow cave could hold against. She needed to make this work. Not because she had a plan. Because the alternative to making it work was walking back down the mountain toward a valley that had already subtracted everything it could from her life. She slept that first night in her coat with her boots on. The pack pressed against her spine served as a windbreak of sorts, blocking the small currents that crept along the cave floor from the mouth. She'd strung the oilcloth across the opening before dark, one rope tied between 2 rock projections, the cloth draped over it, weighted at the bottom with stones. It cut the wind, it did not cut the cold. She lay on the gravel in the dark, listening to the cave breathe, water moving somewhere below the gravel, a drip ticking off a ledge near the mouth, nothing else, feeling the cold come up through the ground into her hip, her shoulder, the backs of her hands tucked under her arms. She woke before gray light with the kind of clarity that comes only from cold. Not rested, not warm, clear. The way glass is clear when forms on it, the cold itself becomes a lens. She lay still for a moment, listened. The oilcloth she'd strung across the opening had held. The drip near the mouth was still ticking. Nothing else. Day 2, she cut hemlock boughs from the slope below the bluff. She worked fast with her folding saw, a small crosscut blade she'd bought in Galax for 60 cents. Carrying armloads up the grade, her boots still wet from yesterday, her breath making short white bursts in the morning air. She laid the boughs thick across the gravel floor in overlapping rows, cut ends down, green side up, the way her father had shown her once when she was 13, camped in a laurel thicket during a late-season hunt. The smell came up sharp, almost medicinal red, chlorophyll, something cleaner than either. She laid her blanket on top, pressed her palm flat against the surface, not warm, but not cold the way stone was cold. The difference mattered. The difference, in fact, was everything. Between sleeping on gravel that pulled heat from the body at a rate the body could not replace, sleeping on a 6-inch mattress of hemlock that insulated, that held warmth the way living things hold warmth. The difference was the difference between waking up stiff in the morning, not waking up at all. Day 3, she rigged the oilcloth better. Rope threaded through grommets she'd punched with her knife tip, 3 deadweight stones she rolled from the creek, each one heavy enough to hold the bottom edge against gusts. She left a 6-inch gap at the bottom right corner for air draw, sealed the rest. When she built her small fire that evening, a careful arrangement of bark shavings, kindling, 2 pieces of dry oak no bigger than her wrist, contained in a ring of creek stones just inside the cave mouth. The heat stayed inside instead of bleeding out through the gap. She cooked her first hot food since leaving a Crossroads store 3 days ago. Dried oats soaked in boiling water, 1 spoonful of rendered lard stirred in. She ate it from the small tin pot, crouched on the hemlock floor, her back against the cave wall, the fire throwing shifting light across the low ceiling. She did not think about much. Thinking, she had learned, was a luxury that came after warmth. Warmth came after shelter. She had shelter. She was building warmth. Thinking could wait. Day 4, she inventoried. She spread everything on the hemlock floor, laid it out in rows the way her father used to lay out his kit before a long hunt, each item visible, each item accountable. The pack had carried 65 liters of choices. Most of them were decent ones. The wool blanket, thick, heavy, gray, purchased in Galax from a woman who wove her own. 2 changes of socks, wool darned at the heels but sound, the bone-handled knife in its belt sheath, the flint and steel kit in a waxed pouch, a coil of good hemp rope 40 feet, a folding saw, a tin pot, a wooden spoon, the first aid tin, 4 days of food at full ration, dried oats, a bag of dried beef, a twist of salt, a small jar of maybe 9 days at half, a collapsible canvas bucket for hauling water, 23 silver dollars in a leather pouch. She'd considered buying one in Galax. A used Springfield rifle, model 1873, had been standing in the corner of the hardware store there, priced at $11. She'd looked at it for a long time. $11 was nearly half her money. Half her money was too much to spend on a tool she might need when she certainly needed the food, the sock, the blanket. She'd walked away from the rifle. She thought about it now, crouched on the hemlock floor, looking at her inventory, knowing that protein would become the critical shortage before the month was out. She had no telegraph access, no way to send word to anyone. Not that there was anyone to send word to. Her mother had died in 1879, her father in 1881, no siblings. The people she'd known in Calhoun were Daniel's people, his church, his world. She'd been grafted onto that world through marriage. When the graft failed, when the court ruling severed her from the property, from the name, from the town's sense of who belonged, she'd gone back to being what she'd been before Daniel, a Ferrell by paper only, a woman from Patrick County with a good knife, a knowledge of weather, a tolerance for cold. She wrote a list on the back of a receipt from the Calhoun General Store, using the stub of a pencil worn down to 2 inches. The list was not cheerful. She folded it, put it in the tin pot, set the pot on the stone ledge near the cave mouth where she could see it each morning. Day 5. She woke to frost crystals on the inside of the oilcloth, each one catching the first gray light like a small, cold star. She lay there looking at them until the light shifted enough to work by. The temperature outside had dropped below 30 overnight. She could tell by the quality of the air at the cave mouth, the way each breath carried a faint burn at the edges of the nostrils. She was moving a loose stone near the cave mouth, looking for a place to wedge her canvas water bucket upright so it wouldn't tip when she filled it, when she felt the shape of it. Round, metallic, lighter than a rock. She pulled it from the gap between 2 limestone slabs. A coffee can, tin-plated, soldered at the seam. The label had rusted away entirely, leaving only a ghost of red print on the metal. The lid had been hammered shut, not pressed, hammered with deliberate blows that had crimped the tin inward at 4 points around the circumference. She pried it open with her knife tip, working carefully because the tin was brittle with rust. Inside, a cold chisel 6 inches long. Below it, a hammer 3-pound head, steel shaft wrapped in rawhide cord that had dried stiff along its length, cracking at the grip in thin brown curls. Both tools nested together in the can as though someone had measured the space before placing them. Not dropped, not forgotten, placed. She lifted the chisel first. The steel was dark with age, but the edge was still true. Whoever had last sharpened it had done so with care. A long bevel ground at a consistent angle. No. It fit her hand the way well-made tools do. The balance point sitting just forward of center so the weight of the strike carried itself. She turned it over in the cold morning light, feeling the heft, the temperature of the steel against her palm. She picked up the hammer. It settled into her grip without effort, the cracked rawhide giving just enough texture to hold. The head was scarred with 1,000 strikes, small bright divots in the face where chisel steel had met hammer steel, each mark a record of a blow delivered with purpose. Someone had used this tool down to its soul. Had worn the rawhide smooth, had compressed the striking face into a shallow dish from years of contact. This was not a tool that had been stored. This was a tool that had been retired. She set both items on the hemlock floor beside her pack, crouched there looking at them. The can, the careful placement, the hammered lid. Someone had stood in this cave, in this exact spot, placed these tools in a container, sealed it, wedged it between the stones near the mouth, where it would be found by anyone who stayed long enough to start rearranging the space. Not by a hiker passing through, not by a hunter sheltering for a night. By someone who stayed. By someone who began as she had begun to treat this cave not as a waypoint but as a foundation. The cold chisel fit her hand like it had been waiting for her hand. It was the first strange thing. She turned it over once more, studying the edge, the angle of the bevel, the particular darkness of the steel, then set it down. She needed a shelf. That was the whole project. Nothing grand. A niche in the back wall, 8 inches deep, wide enough to store her food off the cave floor where the cold came up through the gravel into everything it touched. Her oats, her cornmeal, her small jar of lard, all of it was sitting on folded oilcloth directly on stone, losing heat in one direction, gaining moisture from condensation in the other. A shelf would solve both problems. Elevate the food, create an air gap, let the cave's stable temperature work for her instead of against her. 4 hours of work, maybe. A problem solved. She waited 2 days. Not because the shelf wasn't urgent. Because something about the placement of those tools, the deliberateness of it, the way the chisel's edge had been maintained, the way the hammer's rawhide had been left to crack, but the head kept true, made her cautious. Not afraid. Cautious. The distinction mattered to Addie. Fear was the thing that made you run. Caution was the thing that made you think before you swung. Day 8. October 22nd, 1884. She picked up the chisel. She picked up the hammer. She walked to the back wall. The limestone was the same gray-cream color as the bluff face outside, shot through with hairline fossil traces, crinoid stems. She thought, the segmented columns of ancient sea creatures pressed into stone millions of years before anyone had a name for them. She set the chisel point against the rock at about chest height, positioned her feet, wrapped her left hand around the chisel shaft, her right around the hammer's cracked grip. She swung. The first strike sent a clean chip skittering across the gravel floor, a good sound, sharp, definitive, the sound of steel meeting stone with authority. The second strike opened a white crescent in the gray. She worked in short bursts because the cold locked her arms if she stayed still too long. 10 strikes, then step back. Blow into her hands the breath-making small clouds that dissipated against the ceiling, roll her shoulders. Feel the warmth of exertion move through her forearms, her back, her chest. 10 more. The cave ceiling was low enough at the back wall that she had to angle her swing, no full overhead arc, just a controlled lateral motion, elbow tucked, wrist snapping at the end to drive the chisel tip into the stone. The tool was sharp, the stone was giving. Not soft. Limestone is never soft, but willing to part along its grain lines when struck correctly, to release chips in predictable curves rather than shattering into dust. By mid-morning she had a pocket 6 inches wide, maybe 3 inches deep, dust fine as talcum powder piled on the gravel beneath it, a small white drift that she swept aside with her boot. She stopped to eat half a cup of cold oats, the last of a salt pork twist she'd been rationing since the crossroads. She ate without tasting, her eyes on the wall. The pocket she'd carved was clean, the interior surface smooth where the chisel had sheared along a bedding plane. Good rock, consistent. She could have the shelf roughed in by evening if she kept at this pace. She went back to it. It was in the second hour that she felt the change. Not saw it, felt it. The hammer came down on the chisel bit into stone. The stone responded, but the response was different, a lower note, a resonance the rest of the wall didn't carry. The vibration traveled up the chisel shaft into her left hand, through her wrist, into her forearm, a frequency she hadn't felt in the previous 100 strikes. She stopped, she tapped the chisel handle against the stone with her palm, a flat, solid sound. The sound limestone makes when it's backed by more limestone, which is the sound of density, of mass, of material going all the way through. She moved 2 inches to the left, tapped again, the same low knock, almost like tapping on a door. A hollow note, a resonance that suggested the stone in front of her palm was not backed by more stone, was backed by something else, by space. She tapped again, harder. The sound carried. Not out, not the way a struck surface radiates noise into the air, but in, as though the vibration was being swallowed by something on the other side of the wall, absorbed into a volume she couldn't see. She stood very still. The cave was quiet around her. The drip near the mouth ticked once, twice, then paused. The oilcloth shifted in a gust she couldn't feel. She set her palm flat against the limestone. Cold. The temperature of stone, the temperature it had been since the Ordovician, since this rock was seafloor mud, since it hardened under pressure, folded upward into mountains. She pressed gently, as though pressure might tell her something percussion could not. Then she picked up the hammer, drove the chisel in again. Listening now, really listening to what the wall had to say. She tapped once more. Same low note. Same resonance, like the mountain had swallowed something hollow, kept it hidden, never told anyone. She worked methodically after that, not drilling in, mapping. She moved the chisel handle 3 inches to the right, tapped with her palm against the stone. The sound held that low carrying note, that door knock quality. 3 inches up, still there. She was tracing the edges of something, the way you'd trace a shadow on a wall to find what cast it. The limestone around the perimeter rang solid, a sharp, flat knock, backed by inside that zone the sound fell differently, so softer by a register. He had the shape of it, roughly 5 feet wide, maybe 4 feet tall, starting about 8 inches off the cave floor, rising to just below her chin. A rectangle, not a crack, not a pocket in the geology, not a void left by dissolved mineral, not a fault line, not a bedding plane separation. A rectangle. Rectangles did not occur in natural formations. Rectangles were a human idea. Rectangles meant doors, windows, frames. Rectangles meant someone had measured, planned, built. Rectangles meant intention. She ate nothing. She forgot she had food. The afternoon light came in flat through the cave mouth, low-angled October sun filtering through the oilcloth gap she'd left for ventilation, hitting the back wall at a shallow angle. For the first time she could see what she'd been touching. Thin lines in the stone. The kind of lines that don't come from water or pressure or time, they came from a trowel. Mortared seams, filled in, painted over with something, a pigment, a wash, a clay and lime mixture that had dried almost the same gray as the limestone. Almost. In the flat direct light of late afternoon, in that low October sun that turned every surface into a study of shadow, the lines were darker by a shade, just a shade. Enough. She put her cheek against the wall, sighted along the surface the way a carpenter sights along a board to check for warp. The lines were there, horizontal, vertical. Regular spacing, roughly 9 inches between the horizontals, maybe 12 between the verticals. Careful work, precise work. The work of someone who understood that the best way to hide a wall was to make it look like the wall behind it. Someone had stood in this cave, had built a wall across the back of it, had mortared it, plastered it, painted it, had made the wall look like the rest of the mountain. She had been leaning her pack against this wall for 8 days, had slept with her spine against it, had pressed her hand against it every morning when she rose from the hemlock floor, using it for balance. 8 days of contact with a surface she'd believed was bedrock. 8 days of trusting the evidence of her eyes over the evidence that hadn't been offered yet, the evidence of sound, of vibration, of the mountain's own voice, telling her that something behind this wall was different. Her hands were not steady when she positioned the chisel at the center of the rectangle. She noticed this without judgment. Unsteady hands were a fact, not a character flaw. She positioned the chisel point against the stone at the exact center of the mapped rectangle, wrapped both hands around the hammer's handle, the cracked rawhide rough against her palms. She drove the hammer down. The stone moved inward. Not the way stone breaks, not shattering, not spalling, not cracking along stress lines the way limestone does when struck with force. It moved. It shifted along the mortar seam like a panel, like a section of wall that had been waiting 25 years for someone to find the right place to push. Cracks ran out from the chisel point along the old mortar lines, white dust falling like flour from a shaken cloth. A piece of the facing stone, roughly the size of a dinner plate, dropped inward. She heard it land, not on a floor, on something flat, something hard, something that rang with the particular clarity of worked stone, of stone that had been cut, set, leveled. The sound of arrival, not of debris, the sound of an object coming to rest on a surface that had been prepared to receive it, then silence, then not cave air, not the damp, mineral breath the cave had been feeding her for 8 days, the exhalation of groundwater seeping through limestone, carrying the taste of iron, of clay, of dissolved calcium. This air was different, dry, old, carrying something she couldn't name at first, a scent that didn't belong to geology, to any process the mountain performed on its own. Wood, not fresh smoke, not even stale smoke, but the memory of smoke, wood smoke long since gone cold, pressed flat by years into something more like mineral memory than actual scent. Not smoke you could taste, smoke you recognize the way you recognize a word in a language you used to speak before you forgot you ever spoke it. Under the smoke, something sweeter, old wood, worked wood. The particular scent of a timber species she did not have a name for yet, a dense, close-grained smell that carried the sweetness of tannin, the warmth of something that had once been alive, had been cut, shaped, placed by hand, left in the dark to cure slowly into something harder than the living tree had ever been. She pressed her eye to the gap, 8 inches across, ragged at the edges where the mortar had crumbled, dust still settling in the lamplight, darkness on the other side. Not the darkness of rock, not the close, dense, terminal dark of a stone wall 6 inches from her face. The darkness of space, the darkness of a room. She did not move for a long time. The lamp flame guttered once, twice, steadied. The cold moved around her, patient, unhurried. The gap waited. She did not crawl through immediately. That matters. Everything that came after depended on those 20 minutes of not moving. She knelt at the gap with the oil lamp held up at arm's length, pushed slightly into the opening, the flame casting a weak amber circle into the darkness beyond. She just looked. The light reached maybe 4 feet. It showed her a floor-flat stone, not natural cave bottom, but cut stone, clean. The lower curve of something that might have been a wall, vertical, dressed, rising out of the floor at a right angle. Nothing else. She moved the lamp left, right, tilted it. The gap was too narrow. She could not see enough to know what she was dealing with. The darkness held its secrets the way stone holds temperature, slowly, stubbornly, without being asked. She had learned already. 2 weeks on this ridge, 14 months on the road before that, 28 years of a life that had taken more from her than it had given. She had learned that you do not push through an opening you cannot read. You do not commit your body to a space your eyes have not cleared. You do not trust the dark the way you trust the light, because the dark has no obligation to show you what it contains. So she chipped. Careful now, not fast. She worked the cold chisel around the edges of the gap, following the old mortar seams, the trowel lines she could now see clearly in the lamplight. The facing stone came away in sections, not like demolition, more like peeling back something that had always been meant to come apart, a seal, not a wall. A closure designed to be reopened by someone with the right tool, the right patience, the right reason. The stone was 9 inches thick. She measured it with her thumb span after the third section dropped through. 9 inches of limestone facing, cut to match the cave wall's color, texture, fossil pattern, set in front of whatever was behind it. Mortared so cleanly that she'd been sleeping against it, leaning on it, pressing her palm against it every morning for 8 days, without suspecting a thing. 20 minutes to make the gap wide enough to pass through. 20 minutes of lamplight, her own breathing loud in the cave, the sound of chisel on mortar, the small percussion of each section letting go of the wall, dropping through into the space beyond, landing on that flat floor with a sound that was unmistakably the sound of a room. The temperature outside the cave mouth was maybe 38 degrees that evening. Inside the cave, 44. When she finally leaned close to the widened gap, felt the air coming through from the other side, it was warmer than the cave. Not warm, still cold, but a different cold. The cold of a space that had been sealed, left alone long enough to find its own equilibrium. The cold of stillness, dry, absolutely dry. The air that moved through the gap carried no moisture, no mineral tang, no taste of groundwater. It carried only the wood smoke memory, the sweet dark scent of aged timber, the silence of a place that had been waiting. She could fit through now. The gap was wide enough, roughly 2 feet across, 3 feet tall. The edges still ragged with old mortar, dust coating the lower lip. She could see more with the lamp pushed through, the flat stone floor extending into darkness, the vertical wall she'd glimpsed earlier, a corner where floor met wall at a clean right angle. Man-made geometry, human precision. She knelt at the threshold for another moment. The lamp flame leaned toward the gap drawn by the slight pressure differential between the cave's air, the room's air. The fire wanted to go in. The fire knew something she hadn't confirmed yet, that the space beyond was large enough to draw air, stable enough to hold temperature, sealed enough to maintain a pressure slightly lower than the cave's own atmosphere. Physics was telling her what her eyes could not. The room was real. She slid the lamp through first, pushed it gently across the flat stone floor until it cleared the wall thickness, until the flame was burning inside the room instead of inside the cave. The light expanded. The amber circle widened, reached further, began to catch surfaces she hadn't seen, a curve of stone overhead, a shadow that might have been a corner, a shape at the edge of the light's reach that was too regular to be geology. Then she came through. On her knee, the stone cold against her palms, the dust gritty under her fingers. Through 9 inches of wall, through 25 years of silence, through the gap a man had sealed behind himself like someone closing an envelope. She cleared the opening. She put her hands on the floor of the room. She pushed herself upright. She stood in the dark, raised the lamp above her head, the ceiling arched, stone corbelled in careful courses overhead, each block seated against the next with a precision that made the whole structure hold without mortar at the crown. The arch tightened as it rose, block over, each one offset inward by 2 inches, maybe. The geometry so deliberate that the eye followed it upward the way the eye follows a staircase, expecting the next step, finding it, trusting it, arriving at the top without knowing exactly when the climbing had stopped. The crown sat 12 feet above the floor. The lamplight caught the underside of each block, threw small shadows into the joints between them, made the ceiling look like the ribbed interior of something alive. She turned slowly. The room was 12 feet across at its widest point, roughly circular, the walls curving inward from the floor to meet the corbelled ceiling in a continuous sweep that eliminated corners. No right angles except where the floor met the walls. The floor itself was flat stone, not natural cave bottom, but cut slabs fitted together with the same care as the ceiling, each piece trimmed to mate with its neighbor, the joints so tight that the lamplight couldn't find gaps between them. Swept clean, not dusty, not littered with debris. Clean the way a room is clean when someone has left it in order. The lamp reached the far wall now, its circle expanding as her eyes adjusted. On the north wall, mounted on 2 wooden pegs driven into mortar joints between the limestone blocks, something hung wrapped in burlap. The shape was unmistakable even under the cloth, long, narrow, tapering at one end. A rifle. The burlap had been tied at 3 points with twine, the knots tight, the fabric still intact despite years of hanging. Whoever had placed it there had meant it to last. She turned right. A sleeping platform occupied the east wall, built from dark planks set across 2 stone supports, each support a stack of flat limestone pieces mortared together at the height of a chair seat. Planks were something else entirely. She crossed the room, crouched beside the platform, ran her palm along the surface. Dense, close-grained, hewn with an adze, the tool marks visible in the lamplight, shallow scallops running the length of each board where the blade had bitten, lifted, bitten again. The wood was dark, almost black in the amber light, with a grain so tight it felt more like stone than timber under her fingers. She tried to slide a fingernail between 2 boards, could not. The fit was absolute. At the center of the room, black, squat, permanent as the mountain that held it, a cast-iron stove sat on a sandstone pad mortared into the floor, simple as a loaf of bread, with a single door on the front, a flat cooking surface on 4 stubby legs shimmed with thin stone wedges to sit level. The flue pipe, 6 feet of straight black iron, rose from the stove's top, ran vertically to the ceiling, disappeared into a natural fissure in the rock, where the corbelled courses parted slightly to admit it. A deliberate accommodation. The fissure had been widened with a chisel. She could see the tool marks around its edges, then packed with a clay and straw mixture that sealed the gap between pipe stone. Someone had solved the problem of venting smoke from an underground room by finding where the mountain already breathed, then routing the flue through that opening. She walked to the stove, crouched, opened the firebox door. The hinges protested with a sound like a single note played on a rusted string brief. Inside gray ash, fine as flour, still sitting in the fire pan, shaped in the shallow bowl that ash forms when a fire burns completely down, the last coals collapsing inward as they cool, the ash settling into the depression they leave behind. The last fire this stove had ever held had burned to completion, cooled, settled, waited. She closed the firebox door. Continued her slow rotation of the room. The lamp held high, her shadow moving across the corbelled ceiling like something underwater. The desk was in the far corner, built against the southwest wall. 2 stacked courses of flat limestone slabs formed the legs, each course 3 stones wide, mortared, the top surface leveled with a thin layer of the same clay mixture that sealed the flue. A single thick plank served as the writing surface, the same dark wood as the sleeping platform, hewn the edges chamfered by hand. The plank had been fitted into notches cut into the wall stones on either side so it couldn't shift or slide, built in, permanent. On the desk, nothing but a single object. A book, leather covered, maybe 9 inches by the leather dry along the spine, cracked in 2 places where the binding had been stressed by repeated opening, but intact. The cover had darkened unevenly with age, darker at the edges where hands had held it, lighter at the center where only air had touched it. No title, no marking on the front. Just leather, worn by use into the particular softness that comes from being picked up, opened, read, picked up again. She lifted it from the desk. Heavier than she expected, the pages thick, the kind of paper made for durability rather than comfort, stiff under her thumb as she opened the front cover. She carried it back to the center of the room, set the lamp on the stove's flat top where the light could fall directly onto the pages. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was small, careful. Each letter formed with a deliberateness that told her something about the writer before a single word registered. This was someone who did not write often, but who wrote with intention when they did. Someone who treated the act of putting words on paper as a form of construction, each letter a stone set in place, each word a course laid true. The ink had faded to a color like old creek water, brown at the edges, darker at the center of each stroke where the pen had pressed hardest. At the top of the page a date, March 4th, 1859. Below it 1 sentence. Ground is workable. I will start at the back and work outward. Nobody needs to know. She read it twice. The lamp flame leaned sideways in a draft she couldn't feel, straightened, held still. She looked up from the page at the room surrounding her. Start at the back. Work outward. She understood it then. The way you understand something that was always obvious once someone says it aloud. The way a lock opens when the right key turns, not with force but with recognition. He hadn't dug in from the cave. He had found or made entry from somewhere else entirely, some other angle, some other approach, a passage or opening she hadn't discovered yet, something on the far side of the ridge or above the bluff, or through a fissure too narrow for her to have noticed from the outside. He had entered from that other direction. He had built this room first from the inside out, cutting, fitting, corbelling from the far wall forward, course by course. working toward the cave. The false limestone veneer she'd broken through that had been the last thing he ever installed. He had built his door, stepped through it, mortared the facing stone up behind himself, sealed the room from the cave side the way someone seals an envelope, the message inside, the closure final, the recipient unknown. The cave had been the lock, the room had always been the house. She sat down on the stone floor. The logbook opened in her lap. She turned to the next page. She read through the night. The stove sat cold. She hadn't lit it, wouldn't light it. Not until she understood what the flue connected to, where the smoke would go, whether the fissure above was open or blocked. That was a problem for daylight. For tonight, she had the lamp, the blanket she'd brought from the outer cave, the sleeping platform she hadn't yet earned the right to use but used anyway because the alternative was the stone floor. She sat cross-legged on those dark planks with the logbook flat across her knees, the oil lamp turned up high enough to read by, high enough that the flame consumed oil at a rate she calculated once, then chose to ignore. The first 50 pages covered 1,859 alone. He wrote the way a man talks when nobody is listening, short declarative sentences, no sentiment, measurements everywhere. The sentences had the quality of stones laid in a wall, each one bearing weight, each one placed with purpose, none of them decorative. Cut 14 inches today, limestone runs softer toward the north face. Use the star drill and the 3-pound hammer. 4 hours, maybe 18 inches of progress, hands acceptable. She turned pages. The dates moved forward through spring, summer, the brief mountain autumn that compresses an entire season into 6 weeks of color followed by gray. April 12, 1859. Corbel Course 3 complete. The ceiling is holding its own weight now. I do not know why this surprises me. Prized him, she thought, because he was the kind of man who trusted stone more than he trusted himself, who built things to a standard that exceeded his own confidence, who set each block with the expectation that it would fall, then felt something close to wonder when it held. She knew this kind of man. Her father had been this kind of man, the kind who checks a knot 3 times, not because the rope is weak, but because the consequences of failure are too permanent to risk on trust. June 3, 1859, started roughing out the floor, flat stone from the creek bed below the south ridge, carried 6 loads today. Each load 1 slab. The trail from the creek to the entry takes 40 minutes loaded, 20 minutes empty. I am learning to measure distance in weight rather than steps. She read that line twice. Distance measured in weight rather than steps. A miner's mathematics, a soldier's arithmetic. The calculation of a body that has learned the difference between what the map says, what the legs pay. The entries from 1860 shifted focus to the stove. He had found it or traded for it or salvaged it. The logbook didn't specify somewhere down in the valley. A cast iron box stove disassembled into its component parts for transport. The firebox alone had taken 2 trips up the mountain. October 17, 1860, carried the firebox up today 4 miles with the legs I came home with. Took the better part of a morning. He never said anything more about the legs than that. The phrase sat on the page like a stone too heavy to lift, compact, dense, refusing to be moved or explained. She read the line 3 times, left it alone. Whatever those words meant in 1860, before the war that was about to swallow the next 4 years of his life, they carried a weight she could feel but not yet understand. Legs I came home with, present tense, both of them. She would learn otherwise later in these pages, but for now, in October of 1860, he still had both legs, still measured distance in miles rather than pain, still carried cast iron up a mountainside because the room he was building needed heat the way a body needs a heart. Then the pages stopped. April 1861. She turned the page, expecting another entry, another measurement, another load carried, another Corbel course completed. The page was blank. She turned the next. Blank. The next. Blank. She fanned the pages forward, 10 at a time, looking for ink, for handwriting, for any mark at all. Nothing. Blank page after blank page, the paper yellowing evenly across its surface, unstained by anything except time. 4 years. From April 1861 to September 1865, 4 years, 5 months. The logbook contained not a single word. No pages had been torn out, no entries had been scratched through or redacted. The pages were simply empty, as though the man who had been writing in this book with such steady regularity had set down his pen one day in April, closed the cover, placed the book on this desk, walked out of this room, sealed the wall behind him, gone down the mountain, gone to war. She knew what those 4 empty years contained without being told. Every person in Virginia knew. Every family in Floyd County, in Patrick County, in every county from the Tidewater to the Cumberland Gap, carried those 4 years in their bodies the way the mountain carried the room hidden, never discussed in full. She was born in 1856. She had been 5 years old when the war started, 9 when it ended. Her memories of it were a child's memories, fragmented, sensory, disconnected from the politics that adults used to explain what had happened. She remembered her mother standing at the kitchen window for long stretches without moving. She remembered the sound of horses on the road at night, which was not the sound horses made during the day. She remembered her father coming home in the fall of 1865 with a beard she didn't recognize, a silence she couldn't penetrate, a way of standing at the edge of the porch in the evening as though listening for something that hadn't arrived yet. She turned to the next page with writing. September 14th, 1865, one sentence. The ink slightly different, darker, newer, applied by a hand that pressed harder than before, as though the pen itself had become a tool that required more force. I have come back. The left leg has gone below the knee, but the hands still work. She set the book down on her lap, closed her eyes. The lamp flame made small sounds in the silence, the tick of the wick burning, the faint hiss of oil vaporizing into heat. She opened her eyes, looked at the corbelled ceiling above her, looked at the stove, the sleeping platform, the desk. He had built the floor, the walls, the beginning of the ceiling before the war. The corbelling, those careful courses of stone arching overhead, holding the weight of the mountain above them through nothing but angle, gravity, the precise mathematics of compression he had built that after. With one, she picked the logbook back up. The entries from late 1865 through 1866 were sparse. Short sentences, even by his standards. Functional reports on the state of the room after 4 years of absence. Water intrusion along the north wall repaired. Mouse damage to the burlap wrapping on the tools minor. Mortar cracking at the base of the second corbel course repointed. He was assessing damage, making repair, re-establishing his presence in a space that had waited for him the way the stove ash had waited, settled, undisturbed, patient. He did not mention the war. He did not mention how or where he lost the leg. He did not mention a battle, a commanding officer, a homecoming. The silence on these subjects was so complete that it became a kind of statement in itself, not a refusal to remember but a recognition that some experiences could not be converted to sentences, could not be laid out in measurements, in progress reports, in the clean declarative prose he used for everything else. The war existed in his logbook only as absence, 4 blank years. One sentence about a leg, then back to work. By 1867 the entries had regained their rhythm. Longer, more deep. As though the act of building had restored something the war had taken, not the leg was gone, but the capacity to think in straight lines, to plan for, to believe that a course of stone set today would matter tomorrow. July 14th, 1867. She turned to this page near midnight, the lamp beginning to gutter as the oil ran low, her eyes strained from hours of reading handwriting that was never meant to be easy. The entry was longer than most, a full page, both sides, the writing compressed as though he'd had more to say than the paper could hold. The lumber company has bought the land, all of it from Calhoun to Lick Branch. Their survey maps stop at the limestone bluff on the west face of Hatchet Knob. They have never measured this side. This is the only gap I have. She read it again, slower this time, letting each sentence settle. The lumber company, buying land. All of it, not a part, not a section, but everything from the town to the creek, the entire valley floor, the lower ridges, the timber rights, the mineral rights, the future. Their maps stopped at the bluff. They had never measured this side. He had found the one place in the entire geography of Floyd County where no surveyor's chain had been laid, no boundary marker set, no deed recorded. A gap in the map, a blank space on the paper. He had built his room in that blank space the way a man hides a letter inside a book, not behind a lock, but between pages no one thinks to turn. She lowered the logbook to her lap. The room took on a different weight around her. Not heavier, more specific, more deliberate. Every stone in the ceiling, every joint in the floor, every hand-hewn plank on the sleeping platform, all of it reframed by a single paragraph in a logbook written 17 years ago. He hadn't built this room because he wanted to live alone in a mountain. He'd built it because the world below the mountain was being bought out from under people like him, people without deeds, without lawyers, without the particular kind of power that came from owning the paper that said you owned the ground. People who lived on land the way trees lived on land, by being there, by growing there, by having no other place to grow. The lumber companies, the mining companies, the railroad companies, they were buying the paper. Once they owned the paper, they owned the ground. Once they owned the ground, the people on it became tenants, workers, then names on a payroll that could be crossed off whenever the numbers required it. Daniel had been a name on a payroll. Daniel had been crossed off. She closed the logbook, not because she was finished reading, because she needed to breathe. Because the connection between this room, this man's, her own life, the Calhoun number 3 mine, the company lawyer from Richmond, the courtroom where she'd lost the house, that connection was pressing against her chest like a hand. The lamp was dying. She adjusted the wick, coaxed another hour from the remaining oil, then let it go. The room went dark. Not the darkness of fear, not the vertiginous dark of blindness, but the darkness of a closed space that has been dark for years, that knows how to hold a person in its absence of light the way a hand holds a stone firmly, without squeezing, without letting go. She lay down on the sleeping platform. The planks were cold beneath her, the chestnut dense enough to feel almost metallic against her cheek. She pulled the wool blanket tight. She slept. She woke before dawn, though dawn had no meaning inside the mountain. What woke her was sound, the drip in the outer cave, transmitted through 9 inches of stone wall, reduced to a rhythmic tap so faint she might have imagined it. She lay still, listening to the room breathe, different from the cave's breath, slower, drier. The exhalation of a space that had found its own equilibrium decades ago, settled into a temperature, a stillness that nothing outside could disrupt. The stove. She needed the stove working. Whatever the sky was doing outside, she could feel the weather pressing against the mountain the way you feel a headache before it arrives. A subtle change in pressure, a thickening of the air. It was coming. She crawled through the gap in the false wall, stood in the outer cave, looked out. The morning light was thin gray, filtered through clouds that sat on the ridgeline like something heavy. Temperature at the cave mouth. She pressed the back of her hand against the rock, estimated low 30s. Dropping, she went back inside. The flue pipe was the question. 6 feet of straight iron running from the stovetop into the fissure, then an unknown distance through the rock to open air. If the fissure was blocked by debris, by a bird's nest, by years of leaf matter blown in from above, lighting a fire in a sealed stone room would fill that room with smoke faster than she could crawl out. Carbon monoxide had no smell. She knew that from her father, who had lost a hunting companion to a blocked chimney in a cabin near Sugar Grove. The man had gone to sleep by a good fire, never woke up. The fire killed him, but the chimney killed him first. She found the rebar behind the woodpile. A 6-foot length of half-inch iron bar, straight, slightly rusted at the surface, structurally sound. She tore a strip from one of the burlap sacks folded under the desk, tied it to a short piece of rope she'd brought from the outer cave, tied that to the end of the iron bar. A makeshift flue brush. Not elegant. Functional. She disconnected the first section of flue pipe at the collar where it joined the stovetop. The joint was snug but not seized. The pipe lifted free with a twist, the metal scraping against metal with a sound that echoed off the corbelled ceiling. She stood on the sleeping platform to gain height, angled the bar upward into the fissure. It went up clean for 4 feet. She could feel the tip moving through open space, scraping lightly against the rock walls of the fissure, meeting no resistance. Then it stopped. Not hard, not the solid refusal of stone, but the soft, compressive resistance of organic material. Something had accumulated in the fissure at the 4-foot mark, packed tight enough to block the passage. She worked the bar against the blockage. Slow rotations, steady upward pressure, the kind of patience that produces results through persistence rather than force. Debris began to fall. She stepped back, tilted her head away. Pieces of it dropped past the open pipe collar, landed on the stovetop, on the floor around the sandstone pad. A matted wad of leaves compressed by years of moisture into something resembling felt. Something that had been a bird once, small bones, feathers reduced to quills, the collapsed architecture of a body that had crawled into the fissure seeking shelter, found it, never left. Decades of dust compressed into a disc, the color of old mortar, the consistency of dry clay. She pulled the burlap rag through twice. The first pass came down gray-brown, heavy with grit. The second pass came down almost clean. She reconnected the flue pipe, checked the joint, checked the firebox. Empty, dry. Small accumulations of ash in the corners that she swept out with her hand, the ash so fine it rose in a cloud that hung in the lamplight before settling back to the floor like gray snow. The damper rod moved freely, both directions. The mechanism was simple, a flat iron plate inside the flow pipe, rotated by the rod controlling airflow, open for maximum draw, closed to bank a fire overnight. The rod turned without binding, the plate seated cleanly at both stops. Whatever else had deteriorated in this room over 2 years of absence, the ironwork had held. She had split kindling the day before in the outer cave, working with the folding saw on a dry chunk of the dark wood she'd found stacked along the east wall of the inner room. Chestnut, she would learn the name later, from the logbook, but for now it was simply good firewood. Dry, splitting clean along the grain without splintering, producing kindling that snapped between her hands with a sound like a rifle report. She carried an armload through the gap, laid it in the firebox with a handful of bark shavings, 2 pieces of split wood the size of her forearm. Nothing bigger. A first fire should be small, diagnostic. Its job was to test the draw, not to heat the room. She pulled the diamond strike anywhere match from the wax tin in her pack. Checked her father's pocket watch, 4:47 in the afternoon. She noted the time because something in her wanted a record of this moment, the way the man who built this room had recorded things. She wanted to mark the instant when the first fire burned in this stove after 2 years of cold ash, the way you mark a date on a calendar, not because the date itself matters, but because marking it makes it real. She struck the match against the iron lip of the firebox door. The phosphorus head flared white, then settled to yellow. She touched it to the bark shavings. The bark caught, then the kindling. She watched the draw through the open firebox door for 30 seconds, holding her breath without realizing it, watching the smoke. It pulled straight up, no rollback into the room. No hesitation at the collar joint, no lateral drift suggesting a partial blockage she'd missed. The fissure was clear. The smoke climbed the flue pipe, entered the rock, disappeared into the mountain. She closed the firebox door. She sat on the edge of the sleeping platform with her hands between her knees, watching the firebox glass shift from black to amber to orange as the fire established itself. The stove began to tick, the sound of cast iron expanding under heat, the metal adjusting to a temperature it hadn't held in 2 years, remembering the shape it took when it was warm. The ticking was regular, almost rhythmic, a pulse. 40 minutes later, her small pocket thermometer, purchased in Galax, carried since read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. She had been colder than that every single night since October. The warmth didn't arrive the way she expected. Not suddenly, not as a wave. It came the way the room had come, gradually from all directions, as though the stone walls themselves were releasing stored cold in exchange for the heat the stove was offering. The floor warmed first, then the lower walls, then the air at waist height, then chest height. Then the breath she drew in through her nose carried a temperature that didn't make her lungs contract. For the first time in 9 days, she inhaled without bracing. That night, she fell asleep on the sleeping platform with her coat still on, the wool blanket pulled to her chin. She woke at 2 in the morning to a room that had cooled to 58 degrees. The fire was down to coals, a low orange glow behind the firebox glass. She fed it 2 pieces of wood without fully sitting up, her arm reaching from under the blanket to the small stack she'd placed beside the platform for exactly this purpose. The wood caught. She pulled the blanket tighter, slept again. The mountain held its temperature the way it held everything, slowly, stubbornly, without being asked. The stone walls absorbed heat during the hours the fire burned, released it during the hours it didn't, moderating the swing the way a river moderates the climate of its valley. Thermal mass. The principle was simple. The execution, 23 years of cutting, fitting, corbelling stone into an arch that functioned as both ceiling. Insulator was something else entirely. She woke for good at first light, or what substituted for first light inside the mountain, a faint paling of the darkness near the gap in the false wall, where the outer cave admitted a thin wedge of sky that was the wrong color. Too bright, too flat, too white. She crawled through the gap, stood in the outer cave, looked out. Snow, 4 inches on the cave floor already, blown in by a wind she couldn't hear from inside the room, more falling. Small tight flakes moving almost sideways, driven by a north wind that had arrived sometime during the night, while she slept in 60-degree air behind 9 inches of stone. The mouth of the cave had gone quiet in the way only snow makes things quiet, a complete dampening. Every sound absorbed by the white surface, the world reduced to visual information only. Lick branch had gone muffled. The usual drip off the limestone lip above the cave mouth had stopped entirely. Her pocket thermometer held at arm's length outside the cave mouth of 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the room, when she crawled back through, 62 degrees. The stove still held coals from the 2 o'clock feeding. She added 1 piece of chestnut split, dry, 8 inches long, adjusted the damper a quarter turn toward closed. 38 degrees of difference between outside, inside. Between the mountain's surface, its heart. Between the life she would have been living in the outer cave, 14 feet of shallow limestone, a fire she'd have had to feed all night, just to stay at 38 between that life, this one. He had built this room for exactly this morning. The things a man builds outlast the hands that build them. That was not a new idea. But standing in that room, on that morning, with snow accumulating outside, Addie felt the idea land in her chest with a weight it had never carried before. She went back to the logbook. The entries from 1868 through 1875 were mostly about chestnut, where he was felling it, how he was curing it, how long he let it dry before he worked it. He had opinions, strong ones, specific ones about moisture content, about seasoning time, about the particular stupidity of building with green wood. Green wood moves. He wrote this in September of 1873, the sentence sitting alone at the top of a page, underlined one, the only underlined sentence in the entire logbook. You build with green wood, the mountain will teach you patience whether you want to learn it or not. He had hewn every plank on the sleeping platform, every shelf board, the desk surface. All of it cut from dead standing chestnut he dragged up from the hollow below Lick Branch one piece at a time over years. Dead standing trees that had died on their feet, bark slough, heartwood curing in the open air, the moisture content dropping year by year until the wood reached a hardness, a resistance to rot that living wood never achieved. He didn't cut live trees. He waited for the mountain to kill them, then took what it offered. The patience of that, the years of walking the hollow, noting which trees were dying, which had died, which had cured long enough to be worth the labor of felling, bucking, dragging uphill. That patience existed in the logbook only as dates. Felled the chestnut below the second bend of Lick Branch, October 1872, bucked it to 8-foot lengths. Dragged 2 today, will return for the 3rd. The words were flat. The years behind them were not. She set the logbook down once. Around 2 in the morning, looked at the sleeping platform beneath her, ran her palm along the grain. The wood had the color of something that had earned its place, not painted, not finished with anything except time use, the slow oxidation of tannin that darkens chestnut from honey to tobacco to the near black it reached after decades in still air. She pressed her thumb into the surface. The wood did not give. She picked the logbook back up. The entries from the late 1870s shifted again. The construction was mostly complete by then. The room was finished, the stove installed, the sleeping platform built, the shelves cut, the desk set against the southwest wall. What filled the pages instead was the mountain itself, where the deer ran in November following the east ridge at dawn, crossing Lick Branch at the shallow ford below the second bend, where the morels came up in April on the north-facing slope above the creek in the duff beneath dead elms. The particular silence of the hollow after a heavy snow, he described it not as silence but as the removal of all sounds below a certain pitch, so what remained was only high, clean, thin, the calls of winter birds, the crack of ice, the sound the wind made at the crown of the ridge, a sound that didn't reach the hollow floor. He was not a reflective writer. He did not philosophize, he recorded facts. But the accumulation of facts, 16 years of them, covering weather patterns, animal migration, the blooming sequence of wildflowers from March through July, the way the creek changed color after heavy rain, running rust-red with clay for 2 days before clearing, that accumulation began to press on her in a way she had not expected. He had been alone on this mountain for over 2 decades. Not alone the way she was alone, newly arrived, still oriented toward the idea of leaving, alone the way stone is alone, settled into it, shaped by it, no longer comparing. She turned another page. The date read January 14th, 1881. The entry was brief. Roof shelf needs remortaring. Temperature held at 58 overnight with no fire. The mountain is a good insulator. The simplicity of that last sentence stopped her. 5 words that contained 22 years of evidence. Not a theory, not a hope. A conclusion drawn from 2 decades of sleeping inside stone, of trusting the ceiling he'd built because the ceiling had proven itself through winters he'd lost count of. A man who had cut every stone in this room, who understood the physics of thermal mass better than any engineer, because he had lived inside his own experiment for a generation. That man had written 5 words that said everything about what it means to build something you can trust. She turned to the last written page. November 9th, 1882. His handwriting had changed. Still compressed, still vertical, still economical with the page, but smaller now. The strokes thinner, the pressure lighter, as though the hand holding the pen had lost some of its strength. She calculated if he'd been 28 in 1859, he was 51 in 1882. Not old by the standards of men who lived easy lives. Old enough for a man who had spent 23 years cutting stone, hauling timber, surviving winters on a mountain with one leg. The entry filled most of the page. My back will not hold through a 23rd winter in this room. I will go down to Calhoun when the snow breaks in spring. The chisel and the hammer are in the can near the cave mouth. If I do not come back, it does not mean this place has stopped being good. It means it needs someone else. She read it twice, 3 times. Let the sentences sit in her mind the way he let chestnuts sit in the air, curing, hardening, reaching the density they needed before they could bear weight. He had left on purpose, not abandoned the room, not fled, not died inside it. He had made a decision. His body, the one leg, the back worn down by 2 decades of labor the body was never designed to perform alone, had reached its limit. He had recognized that limit with the same precision he brought to everything else, measured it, accepted it, planned his departure the way he'd planned every phase of construction, deliberately, without sentiment, with attention to what would be needed by whoever came after. The chisel in the tin can, the hammer beside it. Tools placed where a newcomer would find them. Not on the first day a person passing through wouldn't move stones near the cave mouth, but on the 5th day, the 8th day, the day when the cave stopped being a waypoint, became a project, became a place someone was trying to make work. She calculated the gap. November 1882 to October 1884, 2 years. He had walked down to Calhoun in the spring of 1883, the spring Daniel died, the spring the number 3 mine collapsed, the spring the world she'd been living in fell through its own floor. While she had been sitting in a courthouse listening to a man in a Richmond suit explain that her husband had assumed the risk of dying underground, Jonas Tate Braddock had been walking down a mountain with one leg, leaving behind 23 years of his life sealed inside stone, trusting that the room would hold, that the tools would be found, that whoever came next would understand. Closed the logbook, set it on the desk, spine facing the wall. She sat for a long time. The stove ticked, the fire held. Outside through the gap the snow continued. Inside the room held 60 degrees. The corbelled ceiling curved overhead, every stone in place, the arch tightening toward its crown with the same patient precision Braddock had brought to every page of his logbook, every joint in his floor, every plank on the platform where she sat. 2 years he had been gone, 2 years. Close enough that she could walk into Calhoun, ask at the general store, find out what had happened to the man with one leg who came down from Hatchet Knob in the spring of 1883. Close enough that he might still be alive. That thought arrived without warning, carrying a weight she wasn't prepared for. If he was alive, she could find him. If he was dead, she could find where. If he had told anyone about this room, she would know soon enough someone would come. If he had kept the secret the way he'd kept everything else precisely, without sentiment as a matter of construction rather than confession, then this room was still what he'd built it to be, a place that existed because no one knew it existed. A gap in the map, a blank space on the page where a person could write her own name. She pulled the blanket tighter, fed the stove, watched the fire through the glass. November arrived without announcement. No dramatic shift, no single morning that divided autumn from winter. The temperature simply stopped recovering during the day. The highs that had reached the low 40s in late October now stalled at 35, 32, 29. The lows dropped below 20. Lick Branch ran slower, its edges thickening with ice that formed during the night, retreated by noon, reformed by evening, each cycle extending the ice shelf a half-inch further toward the center of the stream. The forest around Hatchet Knob had finished its shedding. The oaks stood bare, their branches making a lattice against the sky that looked, from the cave mouth, like the skeleton of something vast laid out for examination. Only the hemlocks held their green, dark, dense, impervious to the season in the way only evergreens manage, hoarding their needles with the stubbornness of creatures that have decided winter is not their concern. The false wall had to come down right in order to go back upright. Addie understood this with the precision Braddock would have approved of, the precision of someone who knows that the quality of a disassembly determines the quality of a reassembly. She spent 3 days on it in the first week of November, pulling the veneer stones out one by one, each section of facing limestone lifted from its mortar bed with the cold chisel angled, eased free. She numbered each stone. Chalk marks on the back face 1 through 23, starting from the upper left corner, moving, then dropping to the next row. The mortar Braddock had used was a lime and clay mix, a recipe she found described in the logbook's entry for September of 1866, 3 parts creek clay, 1 part slate, water enough to make a paste that holds its shape when squeezed, no wet. His lime bucket was still sealed under the desk, a gallon tin with a press-fit lid. The contents had hardened on top, a crust the thickness of her thumb, chalky, cracked in a radial pattern from the center. Below the crust the lime was still viable. She added water from her canvas bucket, at a time, working the mixture with a flat stick, letting it absorb overnight. By morning it had softened to a paste she could spread with her knife blade. Not perfect, workable. She rebuilt the wall from the inside, working through the gap she'd left at the lower right, a crawl space, roughly 2 feet, the minimum she needed to pass between the cave, the room. She set each numbered stone in reverse order, mortaring the joints with the lime clay paste, smoothing the surface with the edge of her knife. When the last stone was in place, number 1, upper left, she crawled through the remaining gap into the outer cave, turned, looked at her work. The wall was good. Not invisible, not to someone who was looking for it, but to a casual eye, a hunter sheltering for a night, a surveyor passing through the back wall of the cave, was limestone, unremarkable. She had left the crawl space open at the lower right corner, concealed behind a deadfall of loose stones she'd arranged to look natural, the gap invisible unless you knew to move the third stone from the left, the one with the fossil crinoid stem visible on its face. That stone was her key, her door handle. She memorized its position the way she memorized everything now, with the absolute attention of someone who understands that forgetting is a luxury she can no longer afford. The first real snow of winter came on November 3rd. She woke on the sleeping platform to a silence that was not silence. It was the muffling of every frequency below a certain pitch, the removal of the bass notes from the mountain's constant hum, leaving only the high registers. The crack of a branch under weight, the distant percussion of ice calving from the limestone lip above the cave mouth, the stove ticking as it cooled between feedings. She checked the thermometer she'd hung on a wooden peg near the gap. 61 degrees at the ceiling. She pulled on her coat, crawled through, stood in the outer cave. 6 inches of fresh accumulation on the gravel floor, blown in by a wind that had shifted north during the night. The cave mouth framed a world made featureless by white, the ridge, the hollow, the trees, all of it softened, reduced to shapes without edges. The temperature outside, 28 degrees. She did not go out until afternoon, when the wind paused long enough to make movement worthwhile. Her 3 snares were set on the east slope, simple loops of hemp rope tied to bent saplings, positioned along the runs she'd identified during her first week. She'd found the runs the way her father had taught her, not by looking for tracks, but by looking for wear. The places where the leaf litter was thinner, where the bark on low branches showed the faint polish of passing fur, where the ground between 2 rocks showed the compression of repeated passage. A gray squirrel in the first snare, the other 2 empty. She reset them, adjusting the loop height on the second, repositioning the third closer to a hickory whose dropped nuts had attracted traffic. She skinned the squirrel over the entrance ledge of the outer cave, working quickly in the cold, her knife stripping the hide in one piece, a technique that required a single cut along the belly, careful separation of the membrane between skin muscle, then a pulling motion, the hide peeling away from the carcass like a glove turned inside out. She stretched the hide on a bent sapling frame she'd wired to the cave wall with twisted cordage. The meat she cut into strips thin enough to dry no wider than her little finger, no thicker than a leather strap. She carried them into the room, hung them on the rack she'd built above the stove. The rack was 4 horizontal dowels, green oak, peeled smooth, lashed to a frame of heavier oak with cordage she'd stripped from the hem of a spare strap on her pack. The frame hung from 2 iron hooks she'd found in the woodpile, driven into mortar joints in the ceiling, at a height that put the meat roughly 18 inches above the stove's flat top, close enough for the rising heat to reach, far enough that the meat dried rather than cooked. The strips curled as they lost moisture, darkening from pink to brown to the deep mahogany of properly dried jerky. 4 days. She packed the finished strips into a clean quart jar she'd found nested behind the bean containers on Braddock's shelves, empty, waiting as though he'd left it there knowing someone would need it. She labeled it in chalk on the glass. Squirrel, Nav 1884. The first item on the shelves that bore her handwriting instead of his. 2 more squirrels that week, a rabbit the following Monday. She processed each one with the same efficiency, the same economy of motion. The hide stretched on the frame beside the previous one, the meat strip dried jarred. By the 2nd week of November, the drying rack above the stove had become a constant feature, always holding something meat, or the shelf mushrooms she'd started bringing in from the downed tulip poplar 40 yards down slope. The mushrooms were oysters. She recognized them from her father's kitchen, where her mother had fried them in butter during the wet springs of her childhood. These were dry, leathery, clinging to the bark of the fallen tree in overlapping fans that ranged from pale gray at the edges to cream at the center. She brought them in by the hatful, her coat serving as a basket when her hands were full. Dried on the rack, they shrank to a quarter of their fresh size, concentrating their flavor into something that, when rehydrated in hot water, tasted like the ghost of the forest floor, earthy, faintly sweet, with a texture that held up to cooking in a way fresh mushrooms never managed. She sealed them in a half-pint jar, labeled it, set it on the shelf. The food inventory occupied an entire evening in mid-November. She pulled every jar from Braddock's shelves, set them in rows on the floor, counted. His inventory from the back pages of the logbook served as her reference, each jar cataloged by contents, quantity, date. She checked his numbers against the physical count. Every figure matched. 31 jars, arranged by type. Dried venison in 8, pinto beans in dried corn in rendered lard in dried morel mushrooms in apple leather in 3. All sealed with wax over heavily, the wax unbroken, the contents visible through the glass dark, compressed. The mountain's constant temperature had preserved them the way a root cellar preserves, without the moisture that a root cellar admits. The room was drier than any cellar she'd ever known. She opened the first one that evening, dried venison. She chose it because protein was the critical need, the nutrient her body was consuming fastest in the cold, the deficit she could feel in the weakness of her grip. She worked the wax off with her thumbnail, set the ring aside, worked the flat lid with the tip of her knife until the seal broke. The smell that came up was clean salt, dried, a faint smokiness that reminded her of the autumn kitchens of her childhood, the weeks when her father brought home deer. Her mother sliced the meat thin, salted it, hung it in the smokehouse behind the garden. She tasted a piece. Dark, dry as leather. Salt cured to a hardness that required soaking before it became truly edible. Good, sound 2 years in a sealed jar in a sealed room at 58 degrees had not diminished it. She soaked 3 strips in hot water from the stove, ate them with a handful of dried corn from another jar, cooked together in the tin pot into a porridge that was not delicious but was substantial, that sat in her stomach with the weight of actual nutrition rather than the hollow lightness of the half rations she'd been surviving on. She calculated 8 jars of dried venison, 6 of beans, 5 of corn, 4 of lard, the critical fat source, 3 of mushrooms, 2 of salt, irreplaceable, essential for preserving whatever she caught on the trapline, 3 of apple leather for sugar. At half rations supplemented by what she could trap, this supply stretched to March, not comfortably, not with margin. But if she was careful, if she didn't waste, if the trapline continued to produce, if nothing went wrong. She wrote her own inventory on the back of the paper wrapper from the cornmeal bag, matching his format exactly. A column for what he'd left, a column for what she needed per week, a column for how far it stretched. The numbers aligned like the stones in his ceiling, each one bearing the weight of the one above it, the whole structure holding because every piece was in its right place. December brought cold that existed in a different category from anything November had offered. 3 separate snowfalls in the first 2 weeks, the first a light dusting that melted by noon, the second a 6-inch accumulation that buried her snare stakes, the third a genuine storm that deposited a foot of snow on the ridge, sheeted ice across the cave mouth, reduced the visible world to a 50-yard radius of white. Lick branch froze solid at the surface. She found running water only at the bend below the second ford, where the current was fast enough to resist freezing, where she could kneel on the ice shelf, reach through a gap with her canvas bucket, fill it with water so cold it numbed her fingers through the canvas before she straightened up. Her trapline contracted. The snares on the upper slope became inaccessible after the third storm, buried under drifts that reached her thighs. She pulled back to the 2 snares nearest the cave, repositioned them along runs that the squirrels still used, their tracks writing cursive scripts across the fresh snow each morning. She caught less. A squirrel every 3 or 4 days, a rabbit once a week if luck held. The rabbit hides she saved, stitched together with the heavy needle from her first aid tin, the beginnings of a liner for her coat that she would finish by January. The shelf mushrooms kept producing. The down tulip poplar, insulated under, continued to push oyster clusters from its bark through December, each flush smaller than the last but still worth the walk, still worth the cold, still worth the half hour of exposure required to harvest them with numb fingers, carry them back up the slope, through the cave, through the gap, onto the rack. She rendered fat from the 2 rabbits she'd taken, combining the small deposits of white tallow from under the skin, around the kidneys, into a pool of liquid she clarified in the cast-iron pot, Braddock's pot, hanging from a hook on the wall beside the stove, black with decades of seasoning. The fat was not much, She poured it into a small jar, sealed it with a disc of wax she'd melted from one of Braddock's existing seals, using only what she needed, replacing the rest. Every resource was a closed system now. Nothing came in from outside except what the mountain offered through her traps, her foraging, her willingness to go out into temperatures that the room had taught her body to forget. By the end of December, she had added 9 jars to the shelves. His 31 had become 40. The new jars sat beside the old ones without distinction, the same glass, the same lids, the same wax seals, only the chalk labels told them apart. His hand small, precise. Hers slightly larger, the letters rounder, the dates in a different decade. 2 inventories on the same shelves. 2 people who had never met feeding each other across a gap of years. The last week of December brought something she hadn't expected, a thaw. 2 days of temperatures in the mid-40s, warm enough to loosen the ice at the cave mouth, to send meltwater running down the bluff face in thin silver threads. She used the reprieve to haul firewood. 6 trips down the east slope to the deadfall she'd identified in November, a massive oak that had fallen across the hollow, its trunk 3 feet in diameter, the wood still sound despite years of lying on the ground. She bucked sections with the folding saw, split them with the chisel used as a wedge, the hammer driving it through the grain, carried the splits up to the cave on her back, stacking them along the east wall of the room in a cord that rose from floor to waist height, enough wood, she calculated, checking the stove's consumption rate against the stack's volume for 6 weeks of modest fires. The thaw broke on December 29th. Temperature dropped from 42 to 18 in 7 hours. She watched it happen from the cave mouth, the air thickening, the sky lowering, the wind shifting from south to north with a finality that felt like a door closing. She sealed the crawl gap, stacked the concealing stones, retreated into the room, stoked the fire, checked the thermometer, 60 degrees. Outside, the mercury kept falling, by midnight single digits. By dawn, the pocket thermometer wedged into the gap between wall panels read 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The room held 59. January was endurance, not dramatic, not eventful, simply long. The days blurred into a rhythm she hadn't chosen but couldn't argue with. Wake, feed the stove, eat, check traps if the snow permitted, process whatever the traps yielded, return, read. The reading was everything. Without the logbook, the winter would have been a sentence she served. With it, the winter became a conversation. She read the entire logbook a second time. Now, not the breathless all-night marathon of her first reading, a page a day, 2, letting each entry settle into her understanding before moving to the next. She began to hear his voice in the sentences, not a literal voice, not a sound she could have described or imitated, but a cadence, a rhythm of thought that revealed itself only through sustained attention. The way he placed a measurement at the beginning of a sentence, before the verb, before the action, 14 inches today, cut along the north face bedding plane. The measurement first, always, the fact before the interpretation, the stone before the wall. She began to understand what the logbook was: not a diary, not a memoir, not a record kept for its own sake. It was a manual, a set of instructions disguised as personal history. Every measurement, every observation about weather, about game, about the curing time of chestnut, about the angle at which a corbel course must be set to carry weight, all of it was information a successor would need. Braddock had been writing to her. Not to her specifically, not to Addie Ferrell of Patrick County, but to whoever came next. To the person who would find the tools in the tin can, break through the false wall, stand in the room, open the logbook, read the first page. He had written 23 years of instructions for that person, had recorded everything he knew about surviving on this mountain, where to find water when the creek froze, which slopes held game in deep snow, how to bank the stove for an overnight burn without choking the flue, what month the morels emerged, what week the ramps pushed through the leaf litter, all of it organized not by theme but by date, because the mountain's lessons arrived on the mountain's schedule, not in any syllabus a man could design. She recognized this because her father had done the same thing, not in a logbook, in her body, in the way he'd taught her to read weather by watching birds, to find water by following animal trails, to skin a squirrel in one piece, to build a fire in rain by splitting wet wood to reach the dry heartwood at the center. He had never told her he was teaching her to survive. He had simply taught her, observation by observation, skill by embedding the knowledge so deeply that she'd stopped recognizing it as instruction, had started believing it was intuition. It was not intuition, it was inheritance. The realization came to her on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of January, while she sat on the sleeping platform with the logbook open to an entry from April of 1878, in which Braddock described the process of tapping a sugar maple, the specific height of the tap hole, the angle of the spile, the number of gallons a healthy tree produced in a good season. She read the entry, looked up, saw the room around her with a clarity that felt like stepping outside on a cold morning. The room was not a hiding place. The logbook was not a record. Both were the same thing: a transfer, a handoff. The passing of knowledge from one pair of hands to the next, across the gap that death or departure or disability opens between the person who knows, the person who needs to know. Her father had done this with his body, his voice, his patience. Braddock had done it with stone, chestnut, ink on paper. The method was different. The purpose was identical: to make sure that what one person learned did not die when that person could no longer use it. She closed the logbook, set it on the desk, opened the drawer, a simple slot cut into the stone beneath the desktop, deep enough for the supplies Braddock had stored there. A sheaf of blank paper, perhaps 30 sheets, the edges yellowed but the surfaces clean. A bottle of ink, dark brown, still liquid when she uncorked it. 2 pen nibs wrapped in a scrap of cloth, a pencil stub. She took the paper, took the ink, took a nib, fitted it into the small wooden holder she found at the bottom of the drawer. Sat at the desk. February 1st, 1885. She wrote the date at the top of the first sheet in letters that surprised her with their steadiness. She had expected her hand to shake from cold, from the significance of the moment, from the weight of following 23 years of careful handwriting with her own uncertain script. Her hand did not shake. The pen moved across the paper with a certainty she hadn't felt since before the mine, before the courtroom, before the morning she'd packed the leather bag. The certainty of purpose, of knowing what the next sentence needed to say. She wrote that the jars had held, all 31 of his, sealed, sound, the contents preserved by the room's constant temperature, its absolute dryness. She wrote that she had added 9 of her own. Squirrel jerky rabbit, dried oyster mushroom, rendered tallow. She wrote the shelf count, 40 jars total. She wrote that she understood now why he had not told anyone. She stopped. Read the sentence back. It was true, but it was incomplete. She dipped the nib. Added, some things survive because no one knows where to find them. She set the pen down. The ink dried on the page in seconds. The room's dry air pulled moisture from everything, including language. She looked at the sentence. 5 words past what she'd meant to write. 5 words that carried more weight than the rest of the page combined. She left them. Over the following days, she wrote the way Braddock wrote facts first, measurements, observation. But she included what he had not, the sources, where she had learned each skill, each technique, each piece of knowledge that was keeping her alive. Her entry on snare placement began with her father's name. Her entry on mushroom identification cited Mrs. Macon, a neighbor in Patrick County who had walked the woods with Addie when she was 11, pointing out edible species, their toxic lookalikes, the differences in gill structure, spore print that separated food from poison. Her entry on meat preservation referenced Daniel, not the Daniel of the mine, not the Daniel of the courtroom, but the Daniel of their first winter together, when he'd shown her how to salt-cure venison in a wooden trough he'd built from poplar planks, packing the strips in layers of coarse salt, pressing them under a weighted board for 7 days. She wrote Daniel's name without flinching. The pen did not hesitate. She recorded the technique the way Braddock recorded his techniques, as information, as instruction, as something a future reader would need. The grief was still there, somewhere beneath the surface of the language, the way groundwater is always there beneath the gravel floor of a cave. But the grief was no longer the point. The point was the salt, the trough, the 7 days underweight. The point was the knowledge surviving the knower. By mid-February she had filled 11 pages. Dense, small handwriting, smaller than she normally wrote, unconsciously echoing Braddock's compression, his economy of space. She organized by topic rather than by date, departing from his format for practical reasons. A reader searching for snare techniques should not have to read through 20 pages of weather observations to find them. She created sections: trapping, water sourcing, food preservation, seasonal foraging, weather reading, shelter maintenance, each section headed with a single word underlined, each entry beneath it numbered, dated, sourced. The logbook stayed on the desk beside her growing stack of pages, his record, her record, companion volumes. Together they covered 50 years of accumulated knowledge about one mountain, its rhythms, its resources, its gift. A library of 2, written to people who had never spoken a word to each other, separated by decades, connected by stone. February came in with a hard freeze, then relented. On the first morning of the month's second week, she woke to a different quality of silence, not snow-muffled frequencies, but still air. Windlessness, a morning so calm she could hear Lick Branch running again for the first time in weeks. A distant sound, liquid, musical, the creek's voice returning after its long winter muteness. The stove had burned down to a bed of orange coals that still held enough heat to keep the room at 59 degrees. She lay on the sleeping platform without moving 110 days. She had been on this mountain 110 days. She counted them the way Braddock counted inches of stone, cut not as a measure of accomplishment but as a statement of fact, a precise number. The difference between what it described, nearly 4 months, a third of a year, versus what it contained, the creek crossing, the chisel, the false wall, the log, the first warm night, the snowstorm, the mushrooms, the rendering of fat, the reading of 23 years of one man's careful thinking, the beginning of her own. That difference was the difference between a number on a calendar, a life. She got up, built the fire back, put water on, opened the logbook to the last written page, Braddock's final entry. She had read it so many times through the winter that the words arrived before her eyes found them, the handwriting smaller than the earlier pages, the pressure lighter, the words measured in that specific way of a man who knows he is writing his last page in a book. She read it once more. Then she turned to her own stack of pages, the 11 sheets she'd filled with her observations, her techniques, her sources. She placed them inside the logbook's back cover between the last page of his writing, the inside of the leather binding, his words first, hers after. The order mattered. She set the book on the desk, bind facing the wall. March arrived the way spring arrives at 3,840 feet in the Virginia mountains, not as warmth but as the withdrawal of extreme cold, a subtle backing off, the difference between 20 degrees at dawn versus 26, between ice that lasted all day versus ice that retreated by noon. Lick Branch ran again in earnest. The snow on the east slope thinned, exposing patches of dark ground, last year's the first green pushing up through the mat ramps, she knew, though they were still too small to harvest. The forest began to make sounds it hadn't made since November, bird calls she didn't recognize, the creak of branches flexing in wind that carried moisture instead of just cold. The drip at the cave mouth, which had been frozen since December, resumed its metronomic tick. She checked her stores. 7 jars from Braddock's original stock remained. 14 of her own, accumulated through the winter. The lard was gone, she'd used the last of it in February. The dried corn was down to 2 jars, the venison had been reduced to 3. She had supplemented, stretched, rationed. She had made it to March, not comfortably, not with surplus, but alive, functional, strong enough to climb the east slope to check traps without stopping to rest, strong enough to split firewood without her arms failing on the 3rd stroke, stronger in a specific way than she had been in October, not in the sense of raw physical power, but in the sense of efficiency, of knowing exactly how much effort each task required, wasting none on hesitation, on uncertainty, on the particular form of exhaustion that comes from not knowing what to do next. The question had been sitting in the room with her for weeks, patient as the stone that contained it. She could stay. Nobody knew she was here. The room was sound. Spring would bring game, forage, longer days for working. She could live here the way Braddock had lived here for years, alone with the stone, the creek, the particular silence of a person who has stopped explaining themselves to a world that never asked the right questions. She could go. Down the mountain. Not back to Calhoun. There was nothing in Calhoun except a courtroom, a company lawyer's memory, the house that no longer belonged to her. Somewhere else. She had skills now that she hadn't had in October. She had knowledge written on 11 pages of paper, backed by 23 years of someone else's knowledge recorded in leather. She had survived a winter alone on a mountain at nearly 4,000 feet, in a room no one knew existed. Whatever waited at the bottom of the mountain could not be harder than what she'd already handled at the top. But before either decision, stay or go, something else had to be finished, the false wall. She spent 3 days in the last week of February restoring it to the state she'd found it in, repeating the careful process she'd mastered in November, the numbered stones, the lime clay mortar mixed from the bucket's dwindling supply, the clay wash applied with her fingertip to conceal the joints. When the final stone sat in place, she stepped back to the center of the outer cave, looked at the wall in the thin March light. The wall was right, the mortar joints invisible. A person could spend a week in this cave without suspecting that the back wall was anything other than the mountain's own limestone, continuous, unbroken. She had preserved Braddock's work. She had preserved his secret. She had preserved the room. She crawled through the gap one last time, stewed inside the room. The stove was cold. She'd let the fire go out that morning, had not relit it. The room held 52 degrees on its own thermal mass, the stone walls slowly releasing the heat they'd absorbed over months of steady burning. It would take weeks for the temperature to equalize fully. The room did not want to be cold. The stone remembered warmth. She packed her leather bag. The wool blanket, now stained with smoke, with grease, with the particular grime of a winter lived at close quarters with fire, food, the knife in its sheath, the flint and steel kit, the buck knife she'd found tucked into a crack beside the sleeping platform, Braddock's knife, not a heavy folder with a brass bolster gone green. She put it back where she'd found it, bolster facing out. For whoever came next, she considered the rifle. It still hung on the north wall, wrapped in burlap, untouched since the day she'd first seen it. She had not fired it, had not unwrapped it. The temptation had been there, especially in December when the trapline went quiet, when protein became a calculation measured in strips of dried squirrel that grew thinner each week. A rifle would have meant deer. Deer would have meant surplus rather than subsistence. But the rifle was not hers. It belonged to the room, to the wall it hung on, to the man who had carried it up the mountain, wrapped placed it on those pegs with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. Taking it would have broken something she couldn't name: a contract, an understanding, an agreement between the room's builder, its inheritor that existed nowhere on paper but was as real as the mortar in the joints. She left the rifle. She left the ammunition beneath the sleeping platform. She left the tools, the cold chisel, the hammer, both placed on the shelf near the gap where the next person would find them sooner than she had. She left food. Not much, her supplies were thin but enough. 2 jars of dried squirrel, 1 of mushrooms, a half jar of salts. She set them on the shelf beside Braddock's remaining stores, his jars on the left, hers on the right, the chalk labels in 2 different hands. She left her pages, 11 sheets, dense with instruction, tucked inside the logbook's back cover. She checked the placement one final time. His writing occupied the front of the book, page 1 through the final entry. Her writing occupied the back, a supplement, and a second voice joining the first. She left one more thing. On a scrap of paper torn from the bottom of her 11th page, she wrote 4 lines in the clearest hand she could manage. The tools work. The stove draws clean. The creek runs under the ice at the second bend. Read his book before you start. He knew this mountain better than it knows self. She folded the scrap, placed it in the tin can with the chisel, the hammer, replaced the lid. Set the can beside the crawlgap stones next to the one with the fossil crinoid on its face. Then she took the cold chisel from the shelf one last time, took the hammer, walked to the interior doorway, the threshold between the room, the false wall, where a single flat piece of limestone ran across the top of the frame like a lintel, 3 feet wide. She crouched, held the lamp close. His initials were there. Cut neat, cut small in the left corner of the lintel stone, JTB 1859. The letters precise, each stroke clean, the serifs sharp even after 25 years of still air passing over them. He had carved them with the same chisel she now held, had struck with the same hammer, had knelt in the same position, had tilted, eyes close to the stone, measuring each letter before committing the blade. 30 inches of open stone to the right. She set the chisel point against the limestone, positioned the hammer in her right hand. She did not rush. She breathed once fully, the room's dry air filling her lungs, carrying the faint residual warmth of the stove, the ancient wood smoke scent of the chestnut, the mineral stillness of the stone. She struck. The first letter took 3 minutes. She cleaned each stroke, blowing away the dust, checking the depth against Braddock's carving with her fingertip, matching his depth, matching his scale. Not mimicking, she was not trying to forge his hand, but respecting the standard he had set. The chisel bit into the limestone with the same clean authority it had shown since the first day she'd held it. The steel was still sharp. The edge he had maintained across 23 years of use, she had maintained across 5 months. That continuity was not accidental. It took 15 minutes. When she finished, she blew the dust away, ran her thumb across the cuts. AF 1884, 1885. Not a claim. A monument, a continuation, one set of initials beside another, separated by 25 years, connected by the lintel stone that held them both. His name, her name, his years, her years, his room, her room, his knowledge, her knowledge, the line unbroken. She put the chisel down, put the hammer down, stewed. Looked at the room one final time in the lamplight, the corbelled ceiling arching overhead, the stove sitting cold on its sandstone pad, the sleeping platform with its chestnut planks fitted tight, the desk with the logbook centered on its surface, the shelves holding their jars in patient rows. Everything in its place, everything as he had left it, plus everything she had added. She crawled through the gap, sealed the crawl space from the outside, setting the concealing stones into position, pressing them firm, checking the arrangement from 3 feet, from 6 feet, from the cave mouth. Natural, unremarkable. A scatter of fallen limestone against the back wall of a shallow cave. Nothing to see. She stood at the cave mouth. March light filled the hollow, angled, golden in a way that October's light had never been. The light of a season that was arriving rather than departing, that was adding minutes to each day rather than subtracting them. Lick Branch ran clear below the bluff. Snow still held in the shadows on the north slopes, but the south-facing grades were bare dark, steaming faintly in the morning sun as the ground released moisture it had held since November. She shouldered the leather pack. Lighter now than it had been in October, she'd used most of what she'd carried in, replaced it with knowledge that weighed nothing, with skills that occupied no space, with a winter's worth of evidence that the body she inhabited was capable of more than the world below this mountain had ever asked of it. She checked the straps, tightened the waist belt, pulled on the coat, its lining now reinforced with rabbit fur she'd stitched in during the long January evenings. She did not go toward Calhoun. She went east along the ridge, descending by a route she'd scouted in late February when the first thaw opened the upper slopes. A trail that dropped through hemlock, then hardwood, then laurel thicket to a valley she'd never entered, a drainage that ran south toward a road she'd seen from the ridgeline but never walked. A new direction, a new distance to be whatever unit she chose, not weight, not steps, not the courtroom arithmetic of who owned what paper. Measured in the particular currency of a woman who had walked into a mountain with nothing except what she carried, found what another person had built, added it, sealed it, for whoever came next. Hatchet Knob rose against the March sky, its limestone bluff pale in the morning light, the cave mouth invisible from this angle, the ridge running northeast to southwest the way it had run since before anyone had been alive to describe it. The lumber company surveyors arrived in April. They measured the west face of the bluff, noted the limestone formation, recorded it as unsuitable for extraction. Their maps stopped at the tree line. Their chains never reached the cave mouth. Their report, filed in the Floyd County Courthouse in May of 1885, described the western slope of Hatchet Knob as geologically unremarkable, commercially unviable, recommended for exclusion from the company's acquisition zone. The tin can sat in the shadow of the third stone from the left. The fossil crinoid caught the afternoon light for 20 minutes each day, its ancient pattern visible to anyone who knelt close enough, who stayed long enough, who had reason to start moving stones. The logbook waited on the desk, 2 sets of handwriting, 2 lifetimes of instruction, the leather binding cracked along the spine but holding, the ink fading but legible. The room behind the stone breathing its slow breath in the dark, 58 degrees, dry, patient, built to outlast the people who built it by exactly as long as it took for the next person to arrive. The rest is waiting.